Welcome to a ride through history. I'm your tour guide. Today we'll be exploring some of the events from the turbulent 1960s. The first event on our top 10 lists are the Stonewall protests. After a popular gay bar in New York was raided by police, protesting broke out in New York and other parts of the country. These protests were similar to those of the African Americans during the Civil Rights Movement. They were trying to prevent discrimination against themselves.
This is the police. We have you surrounded.
Uh-oh, time to go. Our ninth event is Chavez's Workers' Revolution. In 1965, grape pickers in Delano, California held a strike for higher wages and union recognition. Migrant leader Cesar Chavez brought the protest to a national level. Using nonviolent strategies, he was able to involve over 17 million people in the plight of the pickers. The eighth event are the Democratic National Convention protests. Outside of the Democratic Convention of 1968, which was being held in Chicago, thousands of anti-war demonstrators fought with police, National Guardsmen, the Army, and the Secret Service for over 5 days. Anti-war protesters felt that the U.S. was not attempting as hard as was necessary to bring an end to the fighting, so violence broke out. For 5 days, the protesters tried to access restricted areas of the convention, only to be violently turned away. The seventh event are the Kent State shootings. In the year 1970, during protests against Nixon's invasion of Cambodia in Kent State University, 4 students were killed when National Guardsmen opened fire into a crowd of protesters. These students became martyrs for the cause in Vietnam, and that the U.S. should withdraw as soon as possible. The sixth event on our top 10 list are the Watts Race Riots. After attempting to achieve equality through peaceful resistance, the black community began to feel frustrated at the lack of progress being made. This caused dangerous tensions, which often snapped violently. In Watts, Los Angeles, a small accident started a 6-day riot between the residents of Watts and the 15,000 National Guardsmen brought in to stop the riot. The fifth event is the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. On April 4th of 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee, by James Earl Ray. After being shot and collapsing, King was soon declared dead. The murder of Martin Luther King seemed to show that peaceful resistance was not going to be successful any longer, and that violent protests would be the only way to ensure complete civil rights. Up at number 4 is the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Hurry up! Congress is about to vote on the Civil Rights Act of 1964. If we make it in time, we might just get to watch the voting. After JFK's tragic assassination, one of his proposed acts, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, was finally passed. This act outlawed employer discrimination by race or gender and illegalized segregation. This bill also was one of few that were actively enforced by the government. The bill, which would lead to such famous names as the Little Rock Nine, was a true blow against segregation and racism in the United States. At number 3 is the fighting in Vietnam. After an incident in the Gulf of Tonkin, the U.S. decided to create a blank check for the purpose of winning Vietnam. By the summer of 1965, there were over 5,000 bombing raids every month. The attacks had little effect against enemies such as the Viet Cong, and ultimately the attacks would end in failure. These failed attacks showed that the U.S. was losing its ability to fight a war as well as its support from the American people. Number 2 is JFK's assassination. While Kennedy was visiting Dallas, Texas in 1963, he was shot in the head by a man named Lee Harvey Oswald. Oswald was later apprehended, but was murdered before he could be brought to trial. JFK's assassination sent waves of shock through the nation. Many citizens in the U.S. began to show skepticism at the fact that there may have been a conspiracy behind the assassination, potentially the saddest moment in our history. The most turbulent event from the 1960s was the Cuban Missile Crisis. These are Russian missiles! The year is in 1962, and the Russians, who are falling far behind the United States in terms of missile attack readiness, have decided that it will be more effective to move Soviet missiles to bases in Cuba, where their shorter range will allow them to hit the lower 48 states. This created an intense period while the US and Russia stared down the brink of nuclear war. This sparked worldwide fear over the danger that the Russians would attack the US, leading to a complete nuclear Armageddon. These events would ultimately change the world view on nuclear weapons and the danger that they posed. Americans! They're in the tent! Uh-oh. On behalf of our entire crew, I would like to thank you for choosing Rides Through History, and come back soon.